Welcome to Living Mirrors with Dr. James Cook. This episode's a bit different to usual, so I thought it'd be worth unpacking what's going on. So recently someone reached out to me who used to work in the police force in the UK, and they'd recently undergone psychedelic therapy, and they felt it gave them new insight into their own psychology and the kind of psychology that can lead people to seek out certain positions of authority, like in the police, and how their psychology can also lead to abuses of power. And so he reached out to me to see if I'd be interested in a conversation and in sharing his perspective. And I think for him this was particularly important given what's happened this year in 2020 with the killings of black people in America by police. George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, many more. This led to the Black Lives Matter uprisings throughout the world. And he thought this was a particularly important time to share this kind of perspective. So there are a few things that need to be kind of unpacked before we dive in. So over the last decade and a half, there's been a lot of exciting clinical research looking at psilocybin, the active ingredient in magic mushrooms, and its application for many different mental health conditions. And at the kind of core of this research, there are these experiments showing that high dose experiences of psilocybin, where you have a kind of loss of the sense of self and you experience what's called a unitive experience or mystical experience, that these experiences can be used to treat depression in some people, to treat end-of-life anxiety, and it's being trialed for many other conditions at the moment. And also kind of more intermediate doses have been found to be useful in allowing people to uncover hidden traumas and process them. And so in the Netherlands, while psilocybin mushrooms are not legal, psilocybin containing truffles, this other kind of fungus, are legal, and you can buy them from shops, and therapists can offer psilocybin assisted therapy through this method. And this is the approach that the anonymous ex-police officer I'm talking to in today's conversation went with. He also mentions MAPS, which is the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, which is a kind of organization that's really pushing this stuff forward in America. So I think that's all I need to unpack before we dive in. So I hope you enjoyed today's conversation. So we've spoken a bit in messages, and you have a kind of interesting story that I think people would enjoy hearing about. So if you don't mind starting at the beginning, maybe we can go from there.
I'll just call myself Marcus, just for the sake of, that's not my actual name, but I thought it'd be useful to just have a pseudonym to make this easier. But I was kind of particularly attracted to your work because I felt like we had similar backgrounds in some kind of way. So for those that are listening, essentially I kind of grew up in London. I was raised Catholic, and I grew up in quite a rough neighbourhood where I saw a lot of crime and violence, and also I had a troubling home life, to put it mildly. My father was quite emotionally and physically abusive, and so I had quite a difficult start. And I think as well, with the Catholicism thing, I think I do keenly remember times when I was quite young where I thought that any type of intrusive thought or action would be seen and kind of
Yeah,
result in
right. I've been there as well.
So I think essentially, that's my kind of background, and as a kind of a result of that, I kind of wanted to sort of essentially get to a place where I kind of felt that I had some level of power or control of things. So I actually became a police officer in London, and I was a full-time officer after I'd left university. And I left a number of years ago, but because of the background I had, and also the experiences I had in the police force, I had continuous depression. So, and this is something that I didn't seek treatment for conventional treatment rather for about 5 or 6 years after leaving the police force. Didn't want anything on my medical record or whatever. But it was quite a, it was a very serious depression that, involved a lot of suicidal ideation, some planning, and this occurred, from my childhood, right through into my sort of 20s and 30s. And because I sort of didn't want to take antidepressants again, I when I kind of first sought treatment, I did take antidepressants, SSRIs, for about 2 years, after which I stopped working, and I went through the cycle of kind of trying others that just felt horrible. Not wanting to do that again, I actually sought treatment with psilocybin. And first of all, I applied for the research study at Imperial College. That was in 2019, so I kind of applied. But because I sort of didn't hear back, and because my depression was becoming ever worse, I actually made contact with a professional in the Netherlands who'd been trained with MAPS, and it essentially took therapy there over the course of a week. So there were 2 doses. The first was on I think the second day, where I took a box of, about 80% of one box of truffles. And then the kind of following days involved sort of bit of integration, breath work, other exercises. And then I believe it was either on the 5th or the 6th day, I then took a second higher dose, which was, I think I've written it down as 20 grams of truffles. So I think about a box and a half of truffles that you can buy in the Netherlands. And as a result of that, the first trip was kind of very awe-inspiring, and the second trip was very challenging. But as a result of that, my depression significantly alleviated afterwards, and I've been kind of monitoring my PHQ-9 score to kind of assess the severity of my depression. They went down from a sort of in the 20s to a 5 in the weeks following the treatment. So it had a profound and very rapid impact. And I thought it was important to talk about this, because given my previous profession and the legal status, which is hindering access and research, people are being it's much harder for people to access this treatment. And I think that many people can benefit from it. And actually, if it was normalized and the taboo was removed from it, then not only would everybody else be able to do it, but actually those that experience traumatic events on a regular basis, whether they are in the military or emergency services, or anyone else that comes into contact with such experiences, can actually get such treatment, help to process those memories, and to ultimately live a kind of a happier and more connected existence with others. And yes, I think there were also, as well as kind of the issue of sort of curing my depression, there were quite a few insights that kind of happened to me, both while under the influence of the treatment, but also following that maybe, I guess, kind of question some of the kind of the patterns of thinking that had sort of been put into me as a result of my career. And I think that was, changing some of those patterns of thinking could be quite helpful with a lot of the kind of the discussion that's been kind of going around policing and the use of government force
Yeah, of course.
in the world today. I mean, I will caveat that with, I think policing in the UK is quite different to policing in other parts of the world. But ultimately, the biases that I carried and I saw, if there's a kind of any way that, we can sort of help remove those or to make them more visible to others that are
Right.
kind of in these positions, I think that would be particularly useful.
Yeah. Yeah, I think this is very aligned with so first off, your experience is remarkably similar to mine, except I wasn't in the police force or any profession that was traumatic. But I think the insight that you're kind of pointing towards as well is exactly the direction I'm kind of going in and want to kind of explore with other kind of experts in these different related areas. And it seems to me that the through line from kind of our shared experiences of the kind of the negative side of religion, as well as inherited kind of family trauma, through to the kind of the role of the police. It's all tied up with control, I think, and the kind of harm that comes from heavy-handed control of one kind or another is the way that I see it. And I totally see what you're pointing towards, that I think the mainstream dynamic is one that leans very heavily on mechanisms of control, where if we take something like the police force, where most of us are conditioned to just think it's a fundamental necessity that it has to be this way, and that we have to lean way over on the heavy-handed control side. But there's also the wisdom of the kind of bottom-up flourishing, I think, right? If you allow people to heal and you make these medicines accessible to people, the people who are kind of pushed into lives of crime, most people, if they have the opportunity to live a fulfilling life, they don't choose to live difficult lives of crime, right? So
Yes.
I think it's not about to me it's about balance. I'm sure we're not I'm at least not saying there's some we can immediately transition to some beautiful hippie kind of paradise where there's no difficult questions to ask about when we need to use force in a wise way. But there's a world of difference, I think, between that, where you have a culture that understands when you have to, as a last resort, use force, versus our mainstream dynamic, which, as you say, especially I think in places like the United States, right, we see a very quick to lean on the top-down control method. I mean, even having an armed police force, right? That's you and I from the UK, where police officers don't carry guns, right? And I think to Americans, that's quite at least the ones that I've met, that's quite a shock. They're so used to the idea that the way you control the population is through having a kind of police force armed with kind of military grade weapons at the ready. Even even carrying a gun is a very significant step in that direction of leaning on the control side. Is that similar to the kind of perspective that you came to after the psilocybin experiences?
Yes, and actually, I think the point, one point I think I would make is that I think for many people, I mean, first of all, I'll caveat this with, this is just myself sharing my experience, and I think perhaps there hasn't been enough studies kind of, or I'm not aware of studies that kind of finds out what motivates people to either join the police or the military or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
But for me, certainly, it was kind of this kind of feeling of powerlessness and wanting to have particular power and strength in order to deal with that. And it was quite interesting because even when I was in the police force as well, I kind of quickly became, well, not quickly, but it kind of eventually dawned on me that actually to be powerful, you don't need to be necessarily kind of physically strong. And the thing I kind of found before I kind of started on this journey with psychedelics was that actually communication and using your mouth is a far more effective tool than to resort to force. But on the you know, having the kind of the realizations afterwards that kind of dawned on me, I think was a sort of a deeper level of awareness. And I'll kind of give you one example that isn't necessarily related to power, but is certainly related to bias. So I, because of where I grew up and then kind of going into the police force, I was very much hypervigilant. So for a number of years after leaving, I would leave the house and I would immediately start to profile people, for want of a better term. I would sort of like, my eyes would be constantly moving around, and my wife would be like, you know, why are you getting anxious or worried? And I'll say, you know, I said that, well, that person over on the side of the street, they're, you know, looking for someone's role, or they're looking for crack or something. I mean, it was even to the extent by which I would kind of make assumptions based on someone's gait or walk or dress, how they did that. But actually, it also applied to how I treated people of other races. Maybe not treat people, but at least have that kind of that bias within me. And a profound kind of realization of that is that when I, on the day of the first session, I think it was about 8 p.m. So I think about 6 hours after I'd had the dose and sort of had kind of worn off, and I went for dinner. It was a sort of a dark night in Rotterdam, and there were kind of two things kind of on just walking to this restaurant that kind of became apparent to me. Is that the first is I was just walking down this kind of dark street in Rotterdam, and there was a couple that happened to be black who were standing in a doorway, and they were just smoking a cigarette. And I became aware that previously I would have, you know, instantly kind of been put on edge and been thinking, you know, what are they up to? Why are they in that alleyway? Are they going to sort of jump out and do something? But in that kind of state of realization, I realized, well, they're just having a cigarette and talking. There's nothing going on with that. That's nothing to worry about. And the second time, I was, you know, walking down the street, and a group of about 5 teenagers from a Middle Eastern background who were on their bikes suddenly stopped in front of me. And previously, I would have instantly kind of been put on guard, thinking, you know, are they going to rob me, or are they looking for trouble or whatever? And you know, and then it suddenly realized they just kind of stopped to kind of figure out where they were going, or, you know, what street they were going to turn down. And the fact that I was kind of able to see those kind of biases much more clearly, right, and actually so not have the kind of the emotional reaction to them that I previously would have had, made me kind of think of the potential to change people's thinking, you know, change these biases, or to sort of
absolutely, yeah,
you know, have at least some kind of awareness of how kind of influences things. Because had I sort of you know, been in a uniform and that had been in London on both of those occasions, I probably would have you know, challenged or at least spoken to those people.
That's really
despite the
interesting.
fact they've done nothing wrong. And
Yeah,
and that obviously breeds resentment, because again, policing in the UK is very different to the US, so it would have been, from my opinion, uh, softly spoken and just curious. But if someone from a particular ethnic background is having that kind of um, even if they don't have force used against them, is constantly being
right.
suspected of things or being questioned. I can imagine, I can only imagine how hard that is for them, growing up or trying to teach their children, how the world is flawed in that way.
Right.
It makes me sad to kind of realize that. And, I'm just kind of grateful that, I was kind of able to have that insight
Yeah.
in that particular way.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's so much that's really it kind of really, your story really gets to the core of why all this stuff is so important, and you're really, your insights really are not just specific to your experience. They touch on the kind of points that the whole reason I put myself out into the kind of public sphere was to try to communicate exactly what you're communicating now very eloquently. And so I think from the beginning, you have the insight that our perception of the world, you're not perceiving it objectively as it is. You might perceive a threatening teenager, but that teenager is not actually threatening. That's entirely you genuinely perceive it to be the case, but it's because it's coming from your own internal emotional charge, right? And without that trauma, without that fear that kind of is inside most of us, that can push us in the direction of being kind of trigger happy with our labels that and perceptions of people in the psychedelic experience, you can absolutely just see, you're more open to seeing the evidence of the situation, which is, oh, there's a person and they're going about their business, and I don't need to bring this emotional charge to it. But it's also interesting that, as you identified, I'm very impressed with the level of awareness you have around this stuff. I think this is what we should all be aspiring to, instead of proclaiming that we have none of this conditioning. I think the ultimate goal for all of us is to know where we have inherited these kinds of patterns from the culture. But it's interesting the way that, given the kind of the fuel of that perception was fear and a feeling of kind of hypervigilance. It's interesting that it translates immediately to an exercise of power, right? If you're in your uniform and you've adopted this state sanctioned role as someone who gets to wield power, then you can approach that person in your role as a police officer and say, what are you doing? Which is a kind of an odd, it's actually a very powerful position to be in, right? Like, because if you were not a police officer, I doubt you would walk straight up to the people you find threatening, right? Like, I'm not in the habit of walking up to people I find threatening, because I don't feel I'm wielding any kind of power. And I think the thing you're right as well is that a I think I'm optimistic this might change in this generation, because previous generations had so little understanding of trauma and stress and the physiology of this stuff. But your insight, your kind of intuition that even once a month, having a police officer stop you and gently say, "Oh, what are you up to?" That's not an experience I have. And as a result, I can
Yeah,
walk the streets of London and feel like it's my home. I can feel like I'm as I would in my house, where I know I'm not going to be bothered. But I think you're absolutely right that even if it happens twice a year, if you know it happens regularly twice a year, you are now pushed into that state of hypervigilance. You are pushed into a state of stress that's ambiently there in the background. And everything kind of, we're talking about here in terms of kind of mental health and well-being. I think the crucial axis is the extent to which you can feel at home in the world, and you can let go of stress. And if you live in a society that's constantly just sending these signals that you shouldn't be coming to rest, that's unbelievably damaging. And I also wonder if my family also is from London, and there's in that in previous generations, being kind of working class in East London, there was, I think, a huge amount of trauma that got passed down, especially since the war. And one of
yes,
my grandmother is Jewish, and there's a lot of kind of history of anti-Semitism that I think has also been a kind of intergenerational trauma that's been passed down. And so you can see how in previous generations, it was our probably grandparents or parents who was the scapegoats of society, who were seen as the ne'er-do-wells who would be harassed by police. And, you know, I know this is the case for many people in my family. And then the buck kind of gets passed down when you have, as you were kind of pointing to in the start, you have family members who are carrying such stress that's not been able to be resolved because they are the victims of this kind of constant harassment by the status quo, you know, way that society operates, that it it just breeds more and more struggle, more and more trauma that leads to, you know, adoption of power, whether that's violence or positions of power, as you say, with the police. And this is the bringing awareness to this cycle, I think, really is the core issue that leads to most kinds of human suffering in the world, is an unconsciousness around these dynamics. And so it sounds like the psilocybin for you really brought a lot of awareness to this kind of dynamic.
Yes, definitely. And the other kind of, well, I won't kind of call it weird, but uh, let's, I can't think of a different, a correct term here, but as I was reflecting on that kind of issue of power, and you know how you mentioned the traumas that are kind of passed down through generations, it kind of became apparent to me that not just in the police but in politics, which again is another kind of area of power. I kind of curiously kind of checked up the biography of people that were in these positions of power, and looking at them, there were, you know, it's, you know, it could be said that there may have been trauma that they'd either experienced or have been passed down. So,
Mm,
you know, in the UK, just to use these examples, Michael Gove, for example, was essentially adopted after being born out of wedlock in the days where, you know, unmarried mothers wouldn't be able
right.
to keep their own children. Dominic Raab, who you know, his family, I believe, escaped the Nazis in the sort of the late 1930s. And then, you know, Boris Johnson, his, you know, his mother had, you know, psychiatric issues and things. And then, to use the US example, you know, for example, you know, Donald Trump, you know, the kind of the recent book that's come out shows that, you know, he clearly had an upbringing that was damaging to him. And
Yeah,
you know, while none of these people, I don't want to kind of get drawn into politics, but none of these
yeah, right.
people I kind of um, you know, look up to or support. It kind of led me to question, is actually the kind of trauma that people are carrying, you know, perpetuating, you know, more harm. And you know, again, to use your phrase, you know, I don't want to be under the illusion where, you know, if everyone just took psychedelics, the world would be an amazing place and all the problems would be solved. But it does kind of pose the questions about how do we become as individuals and society aware of these kind of issues of trauma, how they
Right.
perpetuate problems with, you know, whether it's people in power or whether it's people in their relationships with
Yeah,
others. And, you know, the kind of dynamic of conflict that then results from that. So, you know, again, to kind of go back to my previous example, I can imagine if someone who's a person of color had been stopped, you know, 10 times in a given month, and they were, you know, completely law abiding and nothing wrong with them, but perhaps on the 11th time they would be, you know, very irritated or, you know, angry about that, you know, rightly so. But because of that, that changes the dynamic they're having with that police officer who or whoever is kind of stopping them. And it kind of, not only does it kind of escalate that you have this, you know, horrible position where, for the person that has that bias, it might kind of confirm that falsely held bias escalate the situation and make it worse for both parties involved, and obviously much worse for the person who's kind of subject to that
Right.
bias. And I think, just by understanding this and exploring this, hopefully it can be, valuable to others, and also, I guess being just aware of our own limitations of, our own ego or thought processes or whatever, and just being able to
Yeah.
take a step back from that.
Yeah.
I hope it could be of a lot of help if more people can do that.
Absolutely. I think you're right that it seems that the dynamic of, as you described, of wanting power comes from wounding in some way. And that's not something that we're raised to understand. The mainstream kind of culture, I think, fetishizes power and thinks that, and it's unsurprising because the narrative gets set by the powerful. So it's a kind of feedback cycle. Every generation there's more trauma, and there's this, you sink or swim. You can either, be empathetic and interested in all this kind of gentle spiritual stuff and then get mocked by the mainstream, or you can become a kind of cutthroat person who wants to rise to the top. And that's why, the kind of, I think, lack of empathy is goes along with this. It's a closing off to the world. We're all born as these open, vulnerable babies, and then events happen that make us think, okay, like I haven't got the energy to extend my empathy infinitely, and there are certain situations where I'm just going to have to put down hard boundaries. And that, to me, is the core psychological problem that our species faces. And I think, there's this, I think a lot of the time when people articulate something along the lines of, if everybody took psychedelics, everything would be fine, there's a lot of mocking, I think, of that attitude, and even within psychedelic spaces. But I think I'm quite I think it really, people are compressing a whole perspective that I think is valid when they say that. And what I would say, I guess, to try and condense it, would be, if everybody had tools that allowed them to bring awareness to how their own trauma leads them to be anything less than perfectly empathetic to and compassionate to other people, and want to collaborate effectively, if we had those tools and we all encouraged each other to do that, and that was the centerpiece of our culture, then all the problems of the world would get solved. I think that's the long version of the shorthand when people, think psychedelics can save the world. And I honestly, do you think this is the best bet? I don't think there's any other kind of explanation you can give. You can't say, if we just shift around resources, so that everyone's fed, then we've solved the problem of starvation. But then we have other political problems, climate change and pollution, and all of these problems, I think, stem from a lack of willingness to compassionately collaborate, and instead this setting of kind of boundaries against empathy and ego investment. And also, it's important to, I think, acknowledge that this happens in all of us. These dynamics are, it's not like there are people who are deranged by this process, and they tend to be labeled kind of clinically narcissistic or sociopathic or psychopathic. But there are certain situations where we will all be pushed into being more or less like this. And you've expressed that very well, that certain situations with a certain person with a certain history that makes them hypervigilant, with certain cues that have been conditioned into them by the mainstream culture, can then become more on the side of, I'm going to protect myself and be less concerned with making space for, I wonder how that person feels, and more concerned with, I'm going to make myself feel safe. And in your experience, as you said, like, the psychedelics really help to make it possible, by directly acting on the brain, to just shift people in the direction of having the space to understand what's going on.
Definitely. And I think, on that topic of sort of, both kind of empathy, but kind of understanding one's, kind of own, I guess, I want a better phrase, own kind of biases or sort of mental models. I think the other thing that, could be beneficial. And again, this is just coming from my kind of personal experience, and I can sort of talk about that a little bit, is that I kind of feel that when it comes to you know, our connection with reality, or our kind of interaction with the world, and I'm going to caveat this with, you know, this is my opinion, and I'm sure you know, there would be different ways to it. But the other thing that kind of became apparent by taking psychedelics was I kind of came to this conclusion that also through meditation and watching my mind at work, is that we're all on some kind of, I feel that we're all on some kind of spectrum of connection with objective reality, and you know, the problems that kind of get in the way with that, you know, stop us from either being empathetic or understanding others that might be seeing things differently. And an example I'll give is that when I was on the second higher dose, which was quite challenging, I won't kind of, the first part was, let's just say, abstract and horrific. The second part, I actually relived some experiences that I had in the police that were traumatic, but I was able to process them. But the other interesting insight is when I went for the top up dose, so I think about half an hour or an hour after I'd taken the first box of truffles, and then I ate the second, which because I was having a horrible time, I kind of thought they were, some people, one might turn the audio off here for 20 seconds if they're going to take anything, but I remember kind of them being like maggots when I was putting them in my mouth. But I kind of felt that I was on the kind of the cusp of both being, you know, in this room in Rotterdam and undergoing this treatment, and then in another a place that, you know, was beyond, that was kind of disconnected from reality. And I felt that I was on the edge of almost kind of being aware where I was, and then being completely unaware of where I was. And when they started to kind of wear off, and I was kind of, the thoughts were kind of coming through, it made me think of times where I'd interacted with people that had mental health problems. And there was one example that I had where we were, so there was a report of someone causing a disturbance in their house, and this was when I was in the police, and there was a check on this person's address, and apparently he'd served many years in prison for a whole host of violent offences, robbery, stabbings, wounding, you know, had a very kind of violent criminal record from the looks of it. So 7 of us went up to his flat to speak to him, just to inquire what was going on. And we opened the door. He opened the door, and we spoke to him, and, you know, asked, you know, is everything okay? And he replied, yeah, I think so. And we spoke with him and said, well, the neighbours have been hearing noise and things, and they're worried that something's going on. And he said, oh, have they? And we said, yeah. And we asked about, you know, what medical treatment he was having, and whether he, you know, wanted to kind of be taken to the hospital voluntarily. And he paused for a moment. He said, yes, I think I do need to go to hospital.
Wow.
And so we kind of stayed in the flat with him, and he was sort of helped him pack his bags and things. And one of my colleagues just happened to stand next to a barbell, so, you know, just a set of weights. And as soon as he stood next to it, he you know, screamed out loud, and he said, "Don't you dare go anywhere." We all kind of like stepped back and said, "Oh, you know, what's wrong? What's happening?" And he said, "Oh, that's a metal I'm going to patent that has a, you know, a particular hardness for it, and I don't want it to go anywhere." And we said, "Okay, don't worry, we won't touch it. Do you want to lock it away?" And he said, yeah, I'll lock it away. And so we let him sort of lock this this barbell away, and secure it so he felt it was safe. And then once that was done, we quite peacefully walked him down to an ambulance, took him to hospital, and he admitted himself voluntarily. But what that kind of, when I was kind of reflecting on that after the trip, it kind of made me feel that kind of more empathetic towards people where psychosis or problems related to that aren't as clear as sort of being entirely psychotic and entirely sane, but rather that there are parts where one might lose touch with reality. And kind of coming back to that sort of spectrum, I actually think that all of us probably, well, all of us, I feel that all of us have beliefs that are either false or have been, we have learned over time that aren't actually objectively true. And I found it quite fascinating because on a personal level, I kind of felt much more empathetic to understand how people who have mental health issues, that it isn't, a sort of a cut and dry scenario, and that there is this kind of, there are varying degrees of issues.
Absolutely, yeah.
It kind of made me feel that, being able to have that kind of experience where I did sort of personally kind of lose touch with, because after the second dose and I went completely into it, there was a point where, according to the people who were looking after me, I was, completely unresponsive and uncommunicative while I was sort of seeing various things and so on and so forth. And it kind of made me kind of appreciate on that kind of empathetic level how kind of beliefs and thoughts are, there's a kind of a whole kind of spectrum of that. And if we understand that, then we can speak with people with more empathy and understanding, even when there's a disagreement.
That's really interesting.
And just sort of where it is, yeah.
Yeah, it's almost like in the 50s when therapists would take LSD when it was being kind of widely regarded as this kind of wonder drug for therapy. They would take it themselves, so they would be able to kind of get insight into the potentially kind of distorted thought patterns of psychotic patients, and which sounds very similar to like I think if if this wasn't something fringe and was instead something routine as a kind of rite of passage, a lot of people working in different services could have a better kind of more flexible appreciation of the different states the mind can inhabit. And I also thought earlier when you were talking about how in situations where you perceive people to be threatening, you might, I think you said it might construct a story, like you might believe that they're looking for crack or something like that. And in that situation, that's effectively a delusion, right? It's similar to the mechanism is similar to the mechanism of psychosis, where you're imbuing a belief that you actually have no evidence for, extremely minimal evidence, but you kind of hold it to be true in a way that, because it makes you feel safer. And I think that actually is probably at the core of psychosis, is stress and not feeling safe in the world, and trying to kind of grab onto stories that make you feel safe, even if they don't really fit the data. But yeah, so I think in all of us there are these delusions at play.
Yeah, definitely. And actually how our delusions almost look for evidence that the delusion is real. I'll give you an example where say I was to stop someone and they didn't have drugs on them, but after a name check they had a drug history, or that they've been any kind of whether it was a real substantive connection that kind of confirmed my opinion that I should have stopped them and searched them, or whether it was even very minor, how they were dressed, or where they were going, or what time it was, or what street they were on, or whatever. It's funny actually speaking about this, because I can't think of a single example where I stopped someone and searched them on the street and came away thinking I was wrong to do that, or I kind of missed something. or I kind of like, because again, it would sort of be this kind of this cycle where, you know, when you're, you know, like going back to my career, when you're kind of, you know, driving around sort of looking for things and so on and so forth, you're kind of sniffing out for clues to kind of like take you in some directions, and, you know, sometimes they're right. And it's funny because I can't tell you quantitatively, you know, how many times I was right and how many times I was wrong. But as I speak to you, kind of, you know, even my belief now that I'm holding in my mind is that, you know, I was right to sort of take those actions, but perhaps that wasn't correct. Perhaps it was just because there was a piece of evidence that fits that bias or that kind of distortion or that narrative. And I kind of, you know, hooked onto that to kind of confirm and reinforce that belief or bias. And then, you know, and then you can imagine, you know, the longer you kind of spend, you know, in that kind of environment, the kind of the more it kind of, for want of a better term, kind of hardwires those kind of patterns of thinking into your brain. And I can imagine for, you know, soldiers in combat, for example, you know, when they come back to civilian life where there is no danger, they still, all the kind of sounds or sights or smells, they still kind of trigger these responses that may result in bad interactions. But, you know, even for those that are involved in everyday life, I can imagine that, perhaps without even thinking of it, you know, and again, I'm not an expert, but, you know, perhaps our brain is kind of looking to kind of confirm and reinforce biases or opinions, rather than, you know, objectively kind of, again, I'm not sure whether objective is the right word, but without kind of being able to kind of step back and sort of assess things in a kind of a clearer, more pure state,
Yeah.
and then decide what to do with that afterwards.
Yeah, I mean, your intuition is absolutely right. I mean, this is absolutely the direction that the kind of most cutting edge theories of how the brain works is pointing towards. That we kind of come up with models of the world, and then we explore in that area to try and confirm them. We don't really, we have, you know, as evolved creatures, we don't really have the luxury to step back and take all of our time in assessing evidence and weighing it. So our cognition is very hacky. It's very, you know, like we find something that works, and then we keep moving in that direction, trying to confirm it. And also
Yeah.
there's the sense of better safe than sorry when it comes to threat detection, you know, so you may pull over someone completely innocent, but then you leave the situation feeling, oh, but they probably deserved it for something. There's probably something going on, you know, or just feeling, as you said, my job is to be looking for these threats. So I'm not going to be dwelling on that. I also wondered so my take on the illegality of something, especially like mushrooms, something, you know, physiologically completely benign and psychologically, you know, I would say only as risky. You know, the main risks are intoxication, which obviously we tolerate with alcohol, so it can't be intoxication. That can't be the reason that they're illegal. And you know, with when it comes to kind of, I would say the only risk would be something like a bad trip, which is a kind of effectively like a panic attack, pushing yourself in. You know, if you were unwise, you could push yourself into some kind of potentially psychotic kind of situations but apparently in a real minority of people, the data is suggesting. So to me, the when I look at the history, the only narrative that makes sense to me is that in a culture that is primarily leaning on control as its way of organizing, these things are too freeing, they're too empowering to the majority of people. And the hippie movement in the 60s was, I think, what happens when enough people have these realizations and they think, wait a minute, we don't want to be co-opted to go fight in unjust wars, we don't want to play these games. And then it destabilizes the system, and that's why these things are illegal. And so to me, I mean, it sounds when I came to that conclusion, I couldn't. It was hard to swallow, because I find it really hard to believe we live in such a sick society that it could function in a way that genuinely doesn't want the population to be too healthy, too empowered, because it's a threat to systems of control. Does that perspective resonate with you as a police officer, someone who's worked within the kind of legal system?
Well, it's interesting because I think when you're on the kind of when you're essentially a bit of a drone in the system,
Hmm.
and again, this is just kind of my personal experience, is that um, rarely do you kind of think of the,
Right.
well, maybe rephrase that. Rarely do you question how you are enforcing the letter of the law. And I'm talking, can I, aside from kind of the use of force or anything like that, but I remember when I was, I mean, just for record, I actually never, um, dealt with anyone that had psychedelic substances on them or that kind of influence them. I'd never knowingly done that.
Hmm.
But you become, you essentially start to kind of like follow the process. So, for example, if I, found drugs on someone, usually it would be crack or heroin or occasionally cannabis, which is still, it does surprise me that the UK is still so far behind in that
Yeah.
respect. It's I personally kind of wouldn't think, I would think very much in terms of a procedural perspective. So, oh, okay, they've got it.
Right.
You're under. You do not have to say anything that may harm your defence. If you do not mention when questioned something which related to relying on court, anything you do say may be given in evidence. And you can see how I kind of repeated the what's called the
Yeah, you've definitely done
cautioning.
that before.
Yeah, which is the kind of I think the equivalent of the Miranda rights in the
Hmm.
US. You just kind of become a bit of a automaton in some respects. You kind of follow the procedures and kind of go through that. So I think at the kind of the bottom level, as in where law and legality interact with humans, it's more of a kind of a bureaucratic interaction from my kind of perspective and experience. Um, but sort of thinking, and again, this is just my opinion and thinking more widely. Definitely, I think the whole war on drugs was sort of, started by the kind of
Yeah.
again, I'm an expert in kind of the moral panic and all that other kind of stuff that goes about it. But again, I think that it's a shame that the change in law is not driven by either evidence or
Hmm.
the kind of the objective need to help people. By so to take cannabis for an example, in the UK, which if you're found with it for the first time, you're given a telling off and don't do it again. If you're found with it for a second time, you are often arrested and charged, which again kind of damages someone's personal prospects. And I can imagine if you were from a group or a background stopped and searched all the time, the chance of you being criminalized for that are far higher than if you're just say like an outwardly facing white middle class person walking through a normal neighborhood. The chance of you being stopped and searched and found and
Yeah.
criminalized for that are far smaller. But I feel that it's it's a shame that it's kind of not guided by the evidence. So the work that, for example, David Nutt had done on kind of the dangers of various drugs, where it kind of objectively, I can't, I don't know whether you know the exact quote on horse riding that he
Yeah, as being more MDMA being more it being safer than horse riding, right? That's what got him fired from the job for telling the truth.
exactly, and he was fired for that, and it's a shame that that kind of hasn't um, taken effect. And I think part of that is again, um, and again, this is my own opinion, perhaps like the perpetuation of power or control in failing to change those laws and to work to remove the taboos, because and again, I'm probably kind of straying into my own political opinion here, but if someone's doing something that is fundamentally not harming anyone else, then why
Right.
prosecute? And also, if you criminalize things, take cannabis for example in the UK. Quite often, the cannabis that is in the UK has been grown through slave labor in houses
Hmm.
where quite often people are trafficked from other countries, held in houses and forced to cultivate plants, under extremely horrific conditions,
Yeah.
so that drug can then be kind of sold and consumed. And so, I would actually argue that the harm that is being done from criminalizing these substances is actually far worse than from legalizing, or at the very least decriminalizing them.
Exactly.
And
Those
then
markets don't exist, right? If you legalize, um, it's the having them be illicit is what makes those kind of criminal activities, it brings the into existence, right? Um, I guess to me it's not surprising that the character of how this stuff was enforced was bureaucratic, as you said. I guess the understanding that I've kind of come to is that yeah, I think when I kind of started thinking about this stuff, especially around the kind of criminalization of drugs, I guess part of me had naively bought the the story that by and large the current kind of state exists to look after us and it has our best interests at heart, and that was the message, and I think some part of me thought that was true. And then what I kind of came to realize, I think, was that what makes far more sense is this picture of when you have a critical mass of people who are carrying trauma and don't realize it, and therefore want to align with power and control, then they will exert power and control. But the way you do that is through kind of a web of basically rules and regulations, bureaucracy that will trap people in a machine effectively. So you have a culture that kind of eats up communities, eats up the human spirit by trapping them in a kind of a web of rules, so that it's not yeah, when I'm talking about power and stuff, I'm not imagining the Metropolitan Police in London kind of hatefully arresting people, but rather, as you say, executing the rules that are there historically to plunder wealth from slavery of other humans and invasion of other nations. And we're still living in the aftermath of this stuff, right? There's when you're talking about the history of the drug war, there's an incredible book by Michelle Alexander called The New Jim Crow, which is just basically goes into detail about how all kind of criminalization of drugs in America was a new method to imprison Black people. It's just another way after the end of segregation to maintain control. And when it became unconstitutional to make explicitly racist laws, they had to use coded language and other things that correlated with certain, or would kind of put in the mind's eye that there's a correlation between certain groups and certain drug use, and then heavily criminalize those communities. There was the situation of crack being, which is chemically the same as cocaine, right? But the media pushed this idea that it was being used more in poor Black communities, and the sentence was something like tenfold or more severe for crack than cocaine, which was associated, in the 80s magazines like Playboy just had openly, adverts for kind of silver cocaine sniffers and things. It was just completely tolerated, whilst communities were being absolutely destroyed under this kind of manufactured moral panic of crack is a drug that will get hold of your children and will destroy them. And again, something that this kind of chemical hook idea of addiction, which is not borne out by the neuroscience. We're now seeing it makes far more sense to think of addiction in terms of trauma and emotional, needing to satisfy certain kind of needing to soothe pain effectively, emotionally.
Yeah.
And now we have this cycle of, instead of treating those people, because the system benefits from scapegoating certain groups, instead of looking after those people and thinking, oh, like we have someone here who's dealing with such systemic trauma that they have to turn to crack to soothe their pain, instead of supporting those people, we're demonizing them further, and that's not a coincidence. And I feel slightly naive for how long, I guess, part of me held on to the idea that the story that no, we're genuinely trying our best, we're looking out for your best interests. I now see that as effectively just another mechanism of control, another mechanism of keeping us from questioning these kind of horrific dynamics that are at play.
Definitely, and I think sort of two points that I kind of thought about just then is that when it comes to law and the state and the enforcement of law, I mean, first of all, most, even kind of supposedly liberal democracies have a lot of historical baggage that still exists either in the statutes or in the kind of the practice of that kind of the law or the practice of the state. And I think to kind of come back to your point where you said that there's this belief that the state would help you or the state would look after you, even if people in control making those laws have that feeling or that kind of that belief, it still doesn't change the fact that there is a lot of baggage and inertia under the surface from ages where what was seen as being the right thing to do, whether that was and these aren't kind of drug examples, but whether it was to kind of throw the poor in workhouses, or whether it was to prevent women from having the vote, or whether it was to prevent people of color being fully engaged or fully enfranchised because they were believed not to be capable of that or anything like that. Even though laws kind of change over time, that the kind of the inertia and the kind of the baggage and the bureaucracy, it doesn't change so fast. So there's always going to be the kind of elements of the past that are kind of retained and haven't been cleansed off. And I think it's actually very good that there's this discussion and awareness of these issues. So hopefully some of those, not necessarily drug related, but on other social issues, how they can be addressed. And I think the other point about I guess the kind of demonization of you kind of gave the example of crack versus cocaine. Again, this kind of like happened lots of other contexts as well. So for example, if not so in the UK but perhaps in the US, a child or is quite wealthy and has good healthcare and wants to get an edge, they can legally get amphetamine, have it prescribed to them, and that's exactly chemically the same as speed. And of course, there are medical applications for that, and that should be it. But if someone was, for example, downtrodden, working 3 jobs, struggling to keep up their trauma, and happened to buy a stimulant that wasn't prescribed, and then was kind of found with that, they would be criminalized. Whereas actually there's the person who's kind of obtained a prescription that legally is correct, but both people are doing it for the same purpose, to kind of try and get energy or try to do something else. It's kind of treated completely differently by the state, despite the fact that regardless of the kind of the rights or wrongs, both people are sort of doing the same thing or trying to achieve a similar goal. It's just sort of in a different form of substance. And likewise, again, referring back to people that are stopped and searched, I remember someone who's a financial services and is well off and has never been stopped by the police or never interacted with them, they might be very frequently using cocaine to do their work, but that they never have any kind of problem. The law or society is kind of structured in such a way that they're kind of not prevented from doing so, and they're not kind of penalized with that. But again, someone who's dealing with significant trauma and has is using that for other reasons, because it is crack, and perhaps because they're in a neighborhood where they are going to be stopped, or they are from a certain ethnic background or have a certain look about them, I even kind of mentioned, how I would stop people based on the gait, how they walked. That I can definitely see how there are kind of many layers of control and many layers of putting power on people that are, it's not just about the kind of the top level statute or the top level regulation that says whether something's illegal or not.
Yeah.
There's so many different layers that kind of perpetuate, that kind of emphasis on power, and treat people differently when actually,
Yeah.
they're all just human beings, um, and but yeah, they kind of, the state is not treating them equally. It's not giving
Yeah.
them the same chance, giving them
And
the
you're right.
same
I mean,
respect. So,
part of the reason, it's so hard to talk about this because it's so all encompassing. I really, I tend to always bring this back to genuinely just to do with the psychology of us as a collective community of humans, because whether we use the term government or state or civilization or anything like this, what we're talking about is just arrangements of people, just the way that humans, groups of humans get together. There is no actual kind of object called a state, right? It's just a kind of a fiction that we kind of come up with. And you can see the way that it goes even beyond that to the fact that I feel we're at a time where tide is changing around psychedelics. I am, even though my parents were working class, I'm effectively not anymore. And due to my kind of some lucky kind of career path I guess I've had, and it means that I'm in a position where by talking openly about my use of psychedelics, I hope that I can be a small part in moving the conversation. Because if I was anything less than perceived to be a kind of respectable, by the kind of mainstream standard person who wasn't at risk of losing their job, or say I was on parole because of again, like being forced into crime from the community I came from, I'm sure I couldn't go around and say to my parole officer when they ask me what I've been up to, say, oh, I've started doing advocacy for people taking illegal drugs. It's
yes, yeah,
that's, there are just layers and layers and layers of social taboo and stuff that we all, if we don't bring awareness to what's going on, we are all part of perpetuating these same kind of mechanisms of control. And control it takes many forms, and it can be anything less than real freedom, real personal freedom, and mutual support of each other in our choices what we do in life, is control. And I feel like at the moment, it's everywhere, and it's like a fish not knowing it's in water, because we're so embedded in systems of control from all sides. And I'm saying this again as someone who faces a very minimal amount compared to the average person, or compared to lots of different communities, I should say. But yeah, it's definitely there. I don't know if it might be interesting to talk about the actual experiences themselves, because you've said that you had kind of insight. You mentioned it was kind of an abstract, painful experience. I don't know if that's something you think might be fruitful.
well, I mean, it's, I guess part of me is trying to think of, because I could sort of, give a kind of a verbal trip report, but I think that might be, each for, people to explore. And I will say that uh, I kind of, I kind of don't want to go into specifics on some aspects, just because I kind of have this worry that if I kind of describe something that it will kind of go into someone's mind, and then
I see.
they might have a
A
bad
good
trip.
point. Yeah, yeah,
That's
yeah.
like,
There's no pressure from my end. Just if you thought there's anything interesting that's relevant to the insights, but no pressure.
I mean, I think one thing I can share is, aside from what I think other people have described as unspeakable horrors, which I had at the beginning of my second trip. So, I mean, to say first of all, the first trip I had was, I mean, kind of very, it was just astounding in terms of there wasn't kind of, I didn't feel during the trip that I kind of had, um, well, I say this now, I think a lot of the things I saw, you know, I wouldn't kind of necessarily say were that, you know, deliver profound insights, although in some kind of funny way they did. So on the first trip, this might just be humorous. I kind of had this recognition of the difference between knowledge and beliefs for myself. So the difference is for me, and again, I'm just sort of describing it from my kind of experience, knowledge is something that some say tell you. And, you know, for me, when I was kind of in therapy, for example, you know, conventional therapy, it would be, you know, working through my therapist and, you know, saying, well, yeah, objectively, I'm a person, and objectively, you know, there's no reason why I should, you know, feel this way. But the belief didn't shift.
Right.
And during the kind of the first trip, one interesting thing was that I a a kind of experience where I sort of emotionally kind of felt the kind of the differentiation between knowledge and beliefs. The humorous thing was, and this is how it kind of all kind of sound strange, is that I had this kind of, well, two sort of visuals that as I kind of saw them, I kind of also had an emotional feeling that as I kind of described them to someone, you know, they don't necessarily make sense, but to me, they kind of did at the same time. I kind of had this vision of um, essentially all my kind of senses kind of blending into a single sense, if that makes sense.
Hmm.
And that belief was a sense as well. So as well as the five senses, you have belief, which is a sixth sense that kind of
That's
informs
interesting.
different worlds. And you know, there were kind of two visuals that kind of like met. You know, one was kind of like a, you know, I kind of saw my own skull with, you know, all the kind of different connections and sensory inputs kind of going all in direction. And, you know, I kind of, I remember thinking like, oh, it does make sense that different senses are really the same thing. They're just kind of, you know, uh, neural connections in the brain, you know, that's how it kind of
Hmm.
works. So that was the kind of first vision. And then rather humorously, I kind of remember this, my beliefs kind of turning into spoons, going into the, going up a cone into the sky. And at the top of the sky was a kind of a psychedelic Richard Simmons with colourful glasses, kind of laughing and smiling at me, which was quite bizarre. So it, you know, that's probably just a, you know, humorous example. And that, actually, I remember the other kind of. I'm actually just going through some notes of one. I actually remember was at some point the kind of I realised I could mould my beliefs and they were like clay. And I think I kind of, it was sort of like a clay form of Tibetan mandala, you know, that I was kind of, so it wasn't sand, it was clay, but I could actually shape things. And as I was, I kind of, I can't remember what beliefs I would think, but I could like have a belief and then moment change it from believing it was true to believing it was false and being dead certain that that was the case. And I felt really profound that, wow, I can actually, there's a possibility to change beliefs and change how things happen. And I remember when I was kind of seeing this, I tried to explain it to the psychologist and the master trained psychologist that was with me. And as I tried to explain this to her while I was kind of wearing a blindfold, I felt a worry that I wasn't being understood by her and that my jaw and my brain couldn't translate it into words. And as
Hmm.
such, a belief then kind of emerged that I communicate and I couldn't speak. But then I was able to say, well, that's not right. I can communicate, I can speak. And then it changed completely afterwards. So that was kind of really, really quite, you know, profound and interesting. And there were all sorts of you know, you know, spaceships and time distortion and all these other things that were just very, very pleasant. On the second dose, the yes, it was disturbing, and I think I'll just kind of say the first part of it was just unspeakable horrors, vast landscapes of horror, and I kind of, but once that kind of went, I kind of, well, it didn't go. The next kind of horrible part of that trip was I had this, and I know this kind of isn't related to policing or whatever, so I kind of had this feeling that I basically relived every single moment of shame and being hungover all at the same time, and I felt violently ill as well. And I didn't vomit, but I was kind of really in the fetal position in incredible pain, you know, physical pain. And that actually quite surprised me, because I was like, I'm quite shocked that the body could hallucinate in that way and I could actually feel physical pain. But, you know, I was kind of helpfully guided by the two sitters, and they told me that actually, you know, what you're going through is a kind of gift, to kind of see this, and we can kind of figure it out. And I feel I kind of have processed some of those, and some of the kind of things I saw are just, I can't think of why I saw them or whatever, and I don't necessarily feel I derive meaning from them. But that kind of sense of shame and hangover and things, it kind of maybe reduce my drinking, which was one good thing. And then later on this trip, where it started to kind of wear off and I was a bit more lucid, I realized that I could actually re-experience memories that I'd had in the past. And this is where I kind of went back to my policing career, and I relived an example where I basically I found someone on the street who happened to be he was a homeless person who was in a phone box, and he was I tried to wake him up at first, and then I realised he wasn't conscious, and then I had to perform CPR on him, and he didn't live. But I relived that experience in such graphic detail, you know, almost more real. And I even remember I actually moved my hands outwardly, just as I did when. So it was like it wasn't as if I was kind of like watching the thing, but I was actually in the scene itself, and I was able to remember trying to resuscitate him and not being successful. And I felt that kind of helped me process that memory. And then I had another memory where I had to, I went into someone's house to kind of investigate what happened to them. And they had died, and they were in a, and again, for anyone listening, I'd suggest maybe switching this off if you don't want to hear. But they were in a state of decomposition.
Wow.
But as a police officer, you have to check the body to ensure there's no sign of foul play. And I actually was sort of walking around and speaking with my trip sitter at this moment, and I kind of reenacted how I actually. So I literally kind of closed my eyes, and I was exactly back where I was, and I reenacted it. And I remember the first thing I did was that even though I was just wearing pajamas, I pulled up my belt before I kind of got down, and that was because the belt I wore that had, you know, it was very heavy, so it had, you know, handcuffs, baton, spray, first aid, and so on and so forth. So whenever you kind of went to bend down or pick up something, you'd have to kind of reposition your belt. And I just remember kind of like that was kind of quite surprising to me, that I actually kind of remembered that physical action before I kind of bent down. And then I kind of reenacted this thing with my eyes closed and kind of picked her up and looked at her. And I remember, and again, please, if anyone's, I'd recommend I be sending this off. But I remember as I kind of picked her up, her head turned round, and I looked in her face, and I remember at the time it was grossly horrific and horrible, and I remember kind of having to kind of, you know, drop her and just kind of like get out of the room and feel disgusted and just horrible. But when I was actually on the trip, I actually like picked her up and kind of held her and sort of looked at her. So I was almost able to kind of like become comfortable with the situation, and you know, and kind of process that. And so I know, you know, I think MDMA has been more looked at for kind of use in, you know, therapy or PTSD or other kind of things. But the fact that I was kind of really able to put myself back very much in the scene of that, quite extraordinary. And then once I realised I could actually do this, I then went through and I kind of it was such a kind of amazing, because I was sort of talking lucid, sort of semi-lucid at this stage. There were some kind of visual distortions occasionally that would kind of pop up as I was talking to my trip sitter. You know, like I remember his face turned half feminine, half male. So, you know, which I think was some kind of empathetic thing. So there was some, but I was able to kind of, I wasn't completely out of it like I had been earlier. But then I realized I can actually, and I felt comfortable, I could actually then kind of relive other memories. And I kind of didn't go through a whole catalogue of traumatic events or whatever. I think mainly because of time, mainly because I didn't realise things, but there were other events where I had to deal with someone that had a knife against someone's throat. And fortunately, nothing happened at that time, but I was kind of able to, as in like never got stabbed or hurt or whatever. But I kind of realised that I can actually see these experiences, reprocess them, and then, you know, if I wanted to, just like I did with the woman that I kind of actually looked at her face, you know, to become comfortable with it, I could, you know, that option was open to me. And so, you know, again, I feel that, you know, for people that have experienced traumatic events, you know, again, I think that it just sort of shows what the potential of these kind of substances, psychedelics or any kind of other entheogen, you know, what they can do. And, you know, the sooner we can, the sooner that these things are open for people to get access to, you know, the better, because, you know, I'd tried meditating, you know, for perhaps 6 years before I sort of did psychedelics as a way to try and manage my depression. Probably about half an hour a day, and you know, I went on a retreat beforehand. So, you know, not anything kind of super serious, but I tried to sort of, I kind of gone far enough in my meditation to sort of experience kind of unusual phenomena, like, for example, distortions in my sense of space, or dissolving, or the temporary ceasing of thoughts, or being comfortable with bad emotions. But the kind of it feels like these medicines allow you to kind of access things, you know, potentially more reliably, more easily, and kind of several magnitude more profound in that kind of way.
I also think for many people turning with severe trauma, meditation can often not be an easy solution. It can bring up a lot of traumatic material that needs to be worked through, and as a human community that's always used these plants, you know, before before we get into the situation we're now in as a species, this was always just the done thing, it seems. So it would seem, it just seems silly on one level to not use these tools to do exactly what you're discussing. Because yeah, I mean, and also, beyond MDMA, which is really leading the charge, as you say, for trauma, psilocybin is being looked at, and anecdotally, it's been found to be very powerful. And in my own experience, and ayahuasca experiences tend to be quite have the character you're talking about. And I mean, those are really, visceral, acute traumas. I'm very sorry you had to go through. And on top of that, having a childhood history of a stressful environment sensitizes us to it kind of traumatizes us there. There's most people have heard of PTSD for post-traumatic stress disorder for the kinds of traumatic events you're talking about that can happen in adulthood. But now there's this concept of complex PTSD, which I suspect is going to apply to many people who might think they, similar to you, you think you just have depression, but it turns out the depression is the final straw when you feel utterly exhausted from living with trauma after trauma after trauma in a situation where apparently until you genuinely break down, the story is that you're fine and you're functional. And did you find when police officers go through these kinds of traumas, is the assumption you just have to kind of shake it off and get on with your life and turn to alcohol if you need to, but there's no kind of program for dealing with trauma?
Well, it's interesting because I kind of brought up the issue of complex PTSD, and I haven't, been diagnosed with that or kind of looked into that or whatever. I've actually tried to minimize my contact with doctors because, well, at the time being in the police, you don't want things on your medical record because it precludes you from doing certain jobs. And I believe, I might be wrong in this, but I believe that might be a similar situation for even, say, doctors, where, and I might be wrong in this, but I think I've heard that doctors may, want to, not disclose that they've had sort of either depression or mental health issues, because then they would be seen as not being capable of doing their jobs or looking after their patients. And being a doctor, I kind of have real full empathy with them because they deal with death on a very frequent basis, even more frequently than I did. And I think, to go back to the issue of complex PTSD, well, normal PTSD, I wouldn't have fit the criteria for any of those, I believe, because each one of those kind of individual events wouldn't have had that kind of particular thing I can kind of point to. So, because essentially, the way we kind of just deal with it is you kind of either, laugh it off or or otherwise kind of shake it off. I remember when I kind of did CPR on the guy, and because he was just completely blue, I just did chest compressions, to try and like boost the circulation there. And when the paramedic arrived, he was just like, yeah, just keep on going, while he just very matter-of-factly pulled out the different, said, all right, I'll take over, put it on his chest. Nothing happened, and said, okay, do you want some alcohol rub for your hands? And I said, yes, please. And he said, you didn't give mouth to mouth. And I said, no. And he said, oh, okay, that's good. And then I literally, kind of wrote up an incident report and then went to work for the rest of the day, and that was it. And similarly for the other event I kind of described, that would just be kind of one instance on a shift where you would just sort of deal with it. So in that example with the woman, once it had been established that there was no foul play or anything, you just wait for the coroner to arrive to collect, and then you kind of get on with the rest of your shift. So there is support, but I feel that many I feel that, I think that society just generally doesn't kind of recognize how traumas can kind of build up over time, and sort of, whether it's in childhood or whether it's in one's job, and also people react differently to traumatic events. One thing that wouldn't phase one person, might cause a severe reaction in another, and that's not to say the other person is weak or is vulnerable or susceptible. It's just a fact, and so I feel that, yeah, I mean, there isn't enough support, and I think there's also there's not that kind of awareness. Again, I'm speaking from my own perspective as to how, over time trauma does build up and does sort of reflect as either complex PTSD or symptoms emerge that kind of would fit or be characteristic of complex PTSD.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right to when I raised the concept of complex PTSD, I think it's a useful conceptual tool, but you're right that we shouldn't lean heavily on the concept of being diagnosed categorically, I think, with something like PTSD, because that's part of the problem. The fact that you and I could have been getting on with our day jobs, carrying huge burdens of trauma, but to have a culture that doesn't, there's such a lack of kind of care, I guess, and prioritizing this stuff, and instead an emphasis on, can you function? If you can function, fine, and then when you stop functioning, then there'll be a diagnosis of PTSD or something similar. To me, that's a really kind of a key component in this stuff. And so I think it'll be one thing to have MDMA for PTSD, and then like veterans and sexual assault survivors and people who've been in car crashes might be able to access it, but then I think for most of us, there are these traumas that are kind of raging that don't fit any neat classification, because it's just the nature of being a human, really, in the situation we find ourselves. When I first started kind of discovering my traumas through the use of psychedelics, I was astounded at how traumatized I was, and I felt quite I had a lot of conversations with people where I felt kind of let down that no one had kind of I didn't realize it myself, and I felt almost let down that friends who had known me since I was very young, and they'd known all the traumas I'd gone through, that no one had ever said, do you suspect you might need support? And then it led to a series of strange conversations as it slowly dawned on me that everyone I was talking to was as traumatized as I was. And that's why people didn't see me as, they thought, no, James is fine. He's doing a PhD. He's functional. He's highly functional. And I remember in these conversations, the penny dropping in me and being like, oh, like you're like me. we're all kind of pretending to be normal, pretending that we don't carry these huge emotional burdens. And we have this, epidemic of especially amongst young men, of suicide. And it's just the mainstream culture, I think, is baffled by it, doesn't understand where it's coming from. But in my mind, it's coming from this entire dynamic of not prioritizing this understanding of emotional health and support and care, and instead being focused on this kind of other mode of operation.
Definitely, and I think the other part of that is there are, things that are, traumatic, that are just kind of accepted as, normal. So, I kind of described, the kind of the, emotional and physical abuse I had as a child. I kind of really only recognized that in the past few years, because before that I just thought that was, that was parenting, really.
Yeah.
And it, it's clearly had an impact. And likewise, I think that we become, we I think that kind of it's very easy to normalize trauma. And I don't mean that people, I'm not talking about normalization as in kind of like putting things down or saying, oh, that's not that bad or whatever, but just for, society not to be, and individuals not to kind of be aware of that and say, yes, that was traumatic, that has had an impact on me, like up until So, I mean, again, this is just a, personal example. I kind of grew up in a rough inner city neighborhood and went to the local inner city school up till the age of 11. And, everyone, and it was in a high rise block. And it was normal to kind of get into the lift or the elevator to go downstairs, and there to be urine or, needles or, a can of high strength alcohol, whatever, just left in the lift. And, I kind of go along and, go to school, and it was because my kind of friends grew up with that and things. And it wasn't until I kind of got into my mother managed to kind of get me into a quite a prestigious secondary school, so a high school. And then I kind of realized, well, I kind of have quite a very different, existence to
Right.
everyone else. But that's just my personal example. There are lots of things that I'm sure that are happening today that are traumatic, that we don't recognize as such, and it's going to take time. And another kind of example, I guess, the whole Me Too movement and things. I think that was the kind of people waking up and saying that kind of sexual harassment and sexual abuse was unacceptable, but clearly because it had been, not talked about or discussed, it appeared to sort of be kind of time. And I guess, some people would have just sort of, thought that they should shake it off or just accept it, rather than kind of to recognize it as traumatic, and to sort of open up the conversation in that kind of way, so people can actually process it and try to take steps to heal.
Yeah, I think you're right. And there's this kind of, it's almost like a numbing down is a kind of a kind of instinctive response to this stuff, is to bury it, try and numb it out, not and not instead of this kind of moving towards it, trying to integrate it. And part of that numbing, I think, is the is where you lose your empathy. If you're not open to even your own emotions and your own trauma, you don't have space for other people's emotions and issues. But it's only by moving into kind of greater openness and vulnerability with this stuff will we move anywhere. And psychedelics are a really great way to do that, because it makes it far more pleasurable as well than it would be otherwise. And I mean, for you, your experiences were sounded quite to a lot of people, it won't sound like a very pleasant, it won't sound like a ringing endorsement for, given the difficulty of the experiences. But I think it's worth kind of, it sounds like you're still very much an advocate for these things, right?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think, as many people I'm sure would agree, they have to kind of be treated with respect. And that is why I kind of sought someone out that had trained with MAPS in the Netherlands, and was, because I was worried about what would come up. And actually, before I went and saw someone, so I had the treatment in October 2019, and beforehand, in August 2019, I just went to the Netherlands, and I thought, well, let me just take a small dose to see whether I can kind of deal with it myself, because maybe I can just sort of, take a box of truffles, stick on some blindfolds, and hey presto, my depression's gone. And I remember I just took 1 gram of truffles. I don't know what that would be the equivalent to for dried mushrooms.
Yeah, I'm not
But
sure.
it was a small dose, considering I took many times that when I was under the therapy. And I just took it in a woodland, just because I thought, let's see how it is. And the effects came on very quickly, and it was a wonderful experience, even with this small dose. So I remember, funny enough, as soon as I kind of started walking in the woodlands, and I know this actually happened because my wife was there with me, I saw a small mouse eating a mushroom, and I kind of became so kind of felt connected, like that was a sign, that something would happen. And we just sort of walked around this woodland, and everything was vivid, and things just seemed to have so much more texture. And I even remember kind of like seeing these plants. I saw a fly on a tree, and it looked like a golden, it was like blazing golden fly. And I remember I took like photos of these things because I thought, oh God, this is incredible. And then, looking at them afterwards, it's like the color saturation has kind of gone way down. But that was all kind of well and good then. And then for some reason, and I don't really know why, I just became emotionally overwhelmed with bitter anger and bitter sadness, really tough emotions that I couldn't explain, or I couldn't kind of figure out where I would deal, where they came from and things. And I think it was at that point where I kind of thought, right, I can't kind of do this alone. And I'm sure, each individual will have their kind of own perspectives and own experience on this. And I guess there are always kind of risks involved with taking these substances. And I think it's for people to sort of understand and kind of assess the risks.
Right.
And so for me, I kind of felt that if just by taking such a small dose, almost overwhelming emotions just kind of came out of nowhere, with no kind of that I could understand any kind of explanation or rationale for why this might have occurred. I thought, well, if it's this bad, taking it at this dose, then I need some professional help before kind of going anywhere further. And I do feel that had I not had the help and support of the people that were with me, that second trip, which was extremely dark and horrific, and very, very uncomfortable at points, that could have caused, well, I don't know for certain, but I kind of feel that could have caused lasting problems that would have outweighed any kind of benefits accrued by that. And I also feel that, I mean, personally as well, I kind of had sort of distortions in my vision for a few days afterwards. So I was just sort of walking around town. There was a statue of a stork or a bird, I think, in The Hague. And, all of a sudden it started to move. And I was like, what the hell? And I just kind of looked at it, and then it stopped. And I thought, that's a bit weird. So I had those kind of things. And again, I think that kind of showed me that there is kind of a spectrum of effects that can happen. So I don't know whether I kind of answer your kind of original question, but I think they should be made more widely available. But I think they just need to be, as I'm sure most people who are in this say, they kind of need to be taken with respect and appropriate measures. And I think it's up to each individual person to sort of decide for themselves how to use them. And for me personally, I kind of feel that I'm not sure whether I feel there's still work to be done psychologically, because I feel like I haven't addressed all my traumas, but I do kind of wonder whether I should take them again, just because I kind of have this feeling that there's a risk for me personally that the things I saw could get much, much, much more worse, or dark, or difficult to deal with. And so I feel that for me personally, I kind of I'm not sure whether I would take them again, or whether or what the circumstances would be, because I kind of seen how bad it I've seen how bad it has been for me at some kind of level, and I don't regret doing it, and I had the help and support to sort of work through that. And then by the end of the trip, as it started to wear off, the positive kind of effects, and I could realize I could kind of process things emerged. Even so, I kind of, I definitely, I can't remember who said this, but someone said about their trips, sort of imagine being locked in hell eternity, you know, for with no sight of escape or whatever. I definitely now fully empathise with that, because I don't feel it got that bad for me, but I could kind of definitely see how it could be that bad.
Yeah.
And so,
Yeah. It definitely
yeah,
seems like you approached it in the right way, you know, kind of trying a small amount yourself and then going towards, you know, a situation where there's a kind of container for this stuff.
yeah,
And I almost wonder if it sounds like, you know, the psilocybin paradigm tends to be this kind of high dose mystical experience to try to, for something like depression, that seems to work by producing a state of temporary relief from the kind of burden of the self and all the usual kind of rumination that goes with that, and it's replaced with a feeling of connection and feeling at home in the world. But I think when there's a lot of trauma to be worked through, those large doses, you know, in the history of how this stuff has been worked through, it tends to be the more kind of intermediate doses that people would use for you know, doing kind of what used to be called psycholytic therapy, which is kind of almost like conventional therapy, but you're on a kind of medium dose of a psychedelic that allows you to kind of loosen everything up and explore. So it sounds like something, you know, like ayahuasca as well as maybe, or just a lower dose kind of experience might be more suited, rather than these experiences where you feel overwhelmed and thrown into the trauma. Because I suspect that, you know, so what we're talking about here is getting to know the kind of shadow side of your mind, right? You're trying to kind of get to shining. It's like we all have this basement full of kind of stuff that's kind of creepy and scary and we don't want to look at. But underneath the basement is the foundation of existence that's wonderful and blissful. And if we want to really connect and be happy in life, we need to kind of, you know, clean out our basements. And so it's understandable that project induces fear. But I suspect for most of us, unless, you know, the trauma is pushing us towards some kind of psychosis, and for most of us, it's possible to go and do that work to clear out that cellar. And it doesn't have to be the psychedelics, but that's like a kind of a flashlight and a cleaning product, or, you know, something that's a really effective tool to do this work. So I wouldn't be surprised if it was there was a way to do it that didn't lead to these more kind of distressing episodes, because, you know,
yeah,
these missteps can definitely be upsetting and potentially re-traumatizing, right?
definitely. And again, I think that, you know, even though I sort of looked up the, I think I kind of looked up beforehand someone who'd kind of done analysis of the variability of psilocybin in this particular strain of truffle that I had, and the variability was, you know, pretty low.
Mm.
It was, yeah, I agree. We're kind of still at that stage where, well, I'm not a professional, so, you know, I'm just speaking from kind of my interpretation, but it sounds like, you know, there's still a lot more work to kind of be done to figure out, you know, what the potential effective doses are for individual use cases, how to get, you know, the best possible outcomes and reduce the risk. But I think, again, you know, I don't want to sort of, you know, I think that the positive thing I would say, and even if, you know, people can kind of look at the research that's been done, you know, the kind of peer review research, is that, you know, the kind of the risk to benefit ratio is strongly in favor of, you know, lasting changes.
Yeah.
And I will say that, you know, my depression kind of did come up to a lesser extent 2 months after kind of finishing doing the treatment, and I think that has been seen in, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that has been seen in some other studies. But, you know, again, I would kind of, you know, I think for most people, the benefits would outweigh the negatives, and, you know, I'd kind of, you know, encourage them to go ahead with it, and, you know,
Yeah.
hopefully we'll be soon at that time where people can do it kind of legally and openly, and that
Yeah.
taboo is removed, and yeah, we can forward.
Yeah, I think the studies I'm familiar with, they usually do something like a 6-month follow-up, and you see a huge, I mean, when I'm looking at those papers, I'm looking at how they differ from other treatments, and what you see is a huge, improvement. But I'm sure there are cases, if you look instead at the angle of, well, is there a bounce back? There might be, you know, not everyone is kind of cured, immediately. I think this perspective of it can shift you into a perspective of seeing your well-being as a project of ongoing emotional health, rather than this kind of binary thing of, now I'm depressed because I've been storing up trauma after trauma. And I personally kind of hope that we can move towards a situation where we could have kind of community circles where there are kind of, people, facilitators who are trained within the community, therapists, because the wonderful thing, especially about mushrooms, is they're cost effectively nothing to grow, and
Yeah.
they do, you don't need a huge amount of input. A lot of the time you're just, a guide is there just to kind of remind you to surrender to the experience and make you feel reassured. And so this is really the most, this could be something we could come up with a situation where most people could access this. There shouldn't be a kind of a high bar for some Silicon Valley produced psilocybin that you have to access through, some private healthcare provider. I think we could totally, once it's decriminalized and potentially legalized, that will be the way forward. Yeah. Well, thank you so much. This has been really, really wonderful. I don't know if there are any other kind of closing
Well,
thoughts you
thank you.
wanted to share.
Um, no, the top of my head, I mean, I think, what I'm motivated to do is, I've been thinking about how I can help, and actually I'm sort of, I'm actually going to contact, well, this is just in the UK. There's a legislator called Crispin Blunt, who's kind of working on this to try, open the kind of, basically make sense of drug laws, particularly when they're, with these substances that, they can really help people. And I kind of feel that, I know I kind of haven't shown my face today, and, part of that I think is because of, the taboo associated with it, and also that, some people who I've kind of described or tried to describe my experiences to, a friend of mine who's, a Hunter S. Thompson fanatic, when I tried to sort of, tell him about it, it was just quite curious to sort of see that there was a bit of kind of resistance to sort of exploring this or accepting it. And that's really surprised me, because I thought that wouldn't be the case. But I think, I certainly feel that I kind of want to, I feel like, if we can kind of contact legislators and other people to kind of show the, the path forwards, then hopefully we can sort
Right.
of improve society and, help access these things. And, again, on the kind of theme of power, stop the, marginalization or the, oppression of, people who are taking these substances, and
Right.
otherwise wouldn't be free to do so.
Yeah. Well, I think by sharing your story, you've really, this is definitely a firm step in contributing to us moving in the right direction. It's a really valuable perspective you've offered, and I really, really appreciate you being so open about everything.
Thank you, James. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks again.